Welcome back to Asian art. Today we're going to continue our discussion about Balinese art and focus on Balinese painting. Painting in Balinese art is a traditional art that is considered a kind of offering that is made a part of decorating or ornamenting temples or recording important histories and religious rites. One of the oldest ways that the Balinese kept records were in these lontar books. This is a technology they learned from Java, which before that came from India. These are called palm leaf manuscripts. And what we see is a palm frond that has been cut and pressed flat and then inscribed with Balinese text and images. You can see inside these books numerous illustrations explaining finer points of religious codes, histories, and ideas. Lontar books were made by Brahmin priests. You can see one here inscribing the palm frond with a fine stylus. Once the image is etched into the flattened and dried palm frond, ink is spread across the surface of the palm frond so that it seeps inside the engraved lines. Once it dries, it's very carefully scraped off the surface so that it remains inset into the palm frond. This makes for a very durable document that can last in the tropics up to about 70 years. Because of the fragile nature of these artifacts, the Balinese are constantly remaking their library. And in this way, the texts have been preserved for hundreds of years in Bali. It is a repository of some of the oldest information we have on the ancient ways of life in both Java and Bali. Another kind of painting the Balinese use is for these calendars called Pali Linden. The Pali Linden is a unique kind of calendar system that is a combination of a 5-day week and a 7-day week. You do not count the calendar as we would normally across one row and then down the next row, but you sort of count by the intersections of both one calendar and the other. So you move down diagonally 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, then up again to the top row, and then around and around until you've gone through all of the different connecting points between these two calendars. A lot of the paintings we see in the calendar and also in the lontar books is done in a style we call the wayang style. Now, we talked about wayang last lecture as a performance tradition that was done in the Bali courtyard, a ritual tradition that has a heritage that goes back to the Mojapahit kingdom. Now, the wayang style is called thus because it, in fact, looks a great deal like the shadow puppets you see here on the right. On the left is a painting. You can see the way in which the figure is posed, the way the hands are articulated. All of these sorts of gestures really evoke the character and the quality of the shadow puppets. We call these the wayang style because they are done in the style or manner of the puppets. Some people have argued that the paintings, in fact, came first, and others the other way around. It's hard to say, but clearly over the centuries, these two art forms are intricately connected and they share a common aesthetic. Note also in the older paintings, commonly use earth tone colors. This is because they're using natural pigments that are indigenous to Bali. Later on, more contemporary painters use bright blues and greens and purples that are imported. These have become much more common today. You also notice that, like in the Lontar books, pictures and words are interspersed inside the paintings. There's a flatness to each of these paintings. There's sort of ornamental or decorative elements that make up trees and bushes, but for the most part, the figure is set off by a blank background. There is no attempt to create an illusionary space. A painting is done over a series of gradual developments, beginning with a very fine, delicate pencil drawing, and then ink lines are brought in to define the forms. And then, after the ink is set in, a very delicate washes are added, and the washes are built up, adding shade and more brilliant coloration. And at the very end, black lines are reintroduced to help define the figure and give them their shape. The Balinese paint with bamboo strips that are sort of semi-absorbent, so they cannot hold a whole lot of ink. And they use very fine bamboo pens that, again, can only hold a tiny amount of ink at any time. So it's a very painstaking process. And as in most arts in Bali, that kind of attention to detail and the kind of labor that these paintings require is all a part of the religious offering that is given to the gods. Here's an example of a contemporary Balinese painting with brilliant colors and vibrant designs. You can still see the very stylized gestures and the figures and the faces and the overall flatness of its character. Notice how the female figure on the left, her arm is double jointed in a way that articulates an idea of beauty and grace in a way that's still very common in both Bali and Java. Now I want to give you an extended tour of a rather famous painting that's inside the roof of the Kerthagosa Pavilion at Klungkung. This palace was built by Dewa Agung Giste Sidiman in the 18th century, and it served as a court of law until about 1945 when Indonesia gained independence. It has been repainted many times. The earliest records only indicate the 1920s, but we can imagine that it had been repainted many times before that. This being the tropics, paintings do not necessarily last very long. So we have records indicating the 1920s, the 1960s, and the 1990s, and on into the present. But the paintings themselves may have changed, or they may have the story that they record today may be something that's been there for quite some time. We don't know. So let's talk about this painting on the inside of the Kerthagosa Pavilion. It starts at the very bottom, toward the edge of the lower edge of the roof, and it moves up to the very topmost part where we see the story conclude among the abode of the gods. The story begins as a meeting of the family of the Pandawa. It is a story called Bhima Swarga and is based on the Mahabharata. Bhima Swarga means Bhima goes to heaven. And in this temple, in this Kerthagosa Pavilion, this story tells of how Bhima learns of the death of his parents. Yudhisthira, the king, has been told by his mother, Kunti, that his father, Pandu, and his other mother, Madri, have died. And unfortunately, they have not passed on to heaven. They've been sent down to hell. This has created great alarm and distress in the whole family. Bhima, Arjuna, Nakula, and Sadewa all raise their hands in alarm as they hear this news, but they are all at a loss at what to do about the fate of their parents. Bhima will not sit still and is designed to go down to hell, rescue his parents, and put them where he believes they rightly belong, in heaven. Off to the far left, you see two rather short, misshapen creatures. These are Twalan and Rada. These are clown characters. If you recall, when we had characters in Sanskrit drama that were clown characters, their job was to sort of add humor to the scene, but also to sort of translate what the other characters was saying. In Bali today, these clown characters have the same role. Now, Twalan and Rada, they speak a kind of ordinary Balinese, whereas Yudhishthira, Kunti, Bhima, Arjuna, Nakula, and Sadewa, they all speak in a kind of high Balinese that is old Javanese, a language that is not commonly spoken among people in Bali, but is a language which is what these stories were first recorded in. Now, even though these stories have this ancient language and they are recorded in books, the story of Bhima Swarga is a rather interesting tale. It was not a part of the original Mahabharata. There is no story in India that follows this plot. So this is a story that uses the characters of the Mahabharata to tell a story that is uniquely Balinese. As our story begins, in the Karthapis, Bhima and his companions, Twalan and Rada, they have gone on a journey to hell. And we see them here in this wonderful panel with the sun shining and them marching off to hell. And in this panel, we see them with their sense of purpose moving along. Look at the beautiful way in which the panel is ornamented. There's no background space. The figures lie flat against the picture plane. One of the longest series of images in this story is a wide collection of images of people being tortured in hell, as if this is what Bhima and his companions are seeing on their way down to hell. It visits through all these various crimes and punishments that people have had set upon them by these demons in hell. You see these people here, their toes licking with the fires of hell. And this one gentleman in the center, he has a mouse that's slowly nibbling off the thread. He is about to plunge into the flames. Another common theme you see in this journey to hell is people boiling in these pots of water. They are being punished for some misdeed that they have done. And here you see the demons sort of stoking the flames and tossing new victims inside. Bhima gets down to hell and he sets to work looking for his parents. He starts upturning these cauldrons, these bull-headed cauldrons, and looking for where his parents are being tortured. This, of course, upsets the balance of hell, and all the demons come to attack Bhima, and they start to fight with all of their weapons. You see bouncing across the strong Bhima. Bhima is a superhuman character. He is part god and part human. And so he has this sort of supernatural power when he goes to fight. And he carries with him his war club, you see there. You see him doing battle here, vanquishing all of the demons. Eventually, he finds his parents, Pandu and Madri, and he tips over their cauldron and releases them. On the far right, you see the god Yama, the god of death, who is quite distraught at this intrusion. Bhima then takes the spirits of his parents up to heaven, but of course the gods are none too pleased with this incursion either, and they begin to fight. Now notice directly behind Bhima, there is a god with his glowing halo who looks very much like Bhima. This is actually Bhima's half-father, god of the wind, Vayu. Now, his genealogy is a little difficult to explain now, how he has two mothers and partly born of a god, but trust me, it's all in the Mahabharata, which you should read someday. But Bhima's father, the god Vayu, knows his weakness, and he's able to strike him down and defeat Bhima while he is in heaven. His clown servant friends are mourning his death when Sanghyang Widiwasa comes to the rescue and tells Bhima it's not yet time for him to die. Bhima, revived, comes back to life and charges back into the fray, where he is able to defeat the gods and set his parents in heaven, giving them the drink of immortality. So this story of Bhima Swarga is a fun adventure, and it's interesting to note that it exists on the walls of a building that was used as a court of law. In Bali, there is a tradition that when you tell a story from the wayang, the story must suit the occasion, must have something to say about what and where this is happening and when this is happening. So having a story of Bhima Swarga on the Kirthagosa Pavilion is in fact a way to comment on its function as a court of law. Remember those long series of images of punishments and rewards and people that were sent to hell? Well, again, those are the kinds of things that people would have meditated on when they were considering finer points of Balinese law. Balinese painting went through a dramatic change after the destruction of the royal court at the hands of the Dutch and the Perang Puputan. For many years, Balinese painters were asked to sell their work to tourists that were arriving from overseas. The Balinese were hesitant to sell traditional work because it was connected to rituals and important ceremonial decorations on their temples. But they eventually began to learn by Western visitors how they could adopt their painting traditions into a new style, which became known as the Ubud and Bunton Style. And they developed their own art school, the Pita Maha School, in 1932. The Pita Maha School was aided by 3 European artists who happened to be staying inside Bali for a number of years. And they were able to teach them techniques that would help them sell work to foreign tourists. The Russian Walter Spies, the Spanish Miguel Covarrubias, and the Dutch artist Rudolf Bonnet were all instrumental in providing different kinds of instruction to help them develop a kind of visual ideas for how to communicate to Western tourists. You'll notice in this painting by Incursion, the flute player, they've created now an illusionistic space, a painting that now suggests a kind of a landscape with a background, a middle ground, and a foreground. It's still all very busy in a Balinese way, but is now no longer distinctly a religious painting of a religious topic. It's more about just sort of everyday life in Bali. Sometimes religious themes come into everyday life, but for the most part, we are seeing the images and ideas of how they play out in the villages around Bali. This is the Bunton style, which tends to have a lot of black ink and very contrasty in character. The Ubud style is much more colorful. They began using tempera paints and started introducing a lot more color into their work. Here again, we see ordinary village life, people going about their work in the fields, someone fishing in a boat. It's just a wonderful use of texture and form to define this sort of overabundance of life in Bali. Here is another painting from Bali in the Ubud style, and it's a series of masks. This is celebrating a holiday called Tumpak Landap. Tumpak Landap is a holiday in honor of metal things in people's lives. And so you see in the background there a kris dagger, the ceremonial dagger that is worn as in religious rites and formal dress. And that would be a kind of heirloom object that would be honored on a day like Tumpak Landap. Tumpak Landap has become a very important holiday because metal things in people's lives in Bali have become very important. Things like cars and motorbikes and computers have now become a very important part of people's lives. And on this day, they will all receive a special offering and a prayer.